Hello students in EDU 622. The purpose of this video is to orient you to the course, as well as to get us started on some of the information and the content in the course. Since our first week is an online session, this will give us some of the background for the course before you delve into the Ravitched book. Let's first talk a little bit about the syllabus. I hope you've had a moment to go through the syllabus. You'll notice on the syllabus that we will have 4 face-to-face meetings, the first one being on May 18th, and 4 online meetings. I will typically open up 2 weeks at a time. After our face-to-face meeting, you'll be able to see the next online and face-to-face meeting preparations all at the same time. Please make sure that you read and prepare for classes. During our face-to-face meetings, we will have lots of discussion about things that you have experienced, and so it's important that you are prepared and ready for those class discussions. A big part of this course is discussion and engaging with the content, and so it's important that you participate fully in our Blackboard discussion board posts. I will ask that each time we have a discussion board post that you post your original reaction by Sunday evening at 11:59, and that then you react to 4 of your classmates by Tuesday evening at 11:59. Now, when you react to your classmates, please make sure that you react with something substantive. Make sure that you're not just saying, "Great job," or "I agree completely." Please add to the discussion. If you challenge something that a classmate says, support your challenge with relevant documentation. Or if you've got something to add to what your classmate said, that would be appropriate as well. But please don't just make it something that's trivial in your response. I will ask that you react to at least 4 of your cohort members. So you don't have to react to everyone, but at least 4 of your cohort members. It would be good that you read all of your cohort members' responses, but then you need to post a reaction to at least 4 of them. Part of this course too is you being able to articulate your own information or your own passion about educational policy, and you will do that with a media summary, a podcast, an education policy presentation, and an advocacy letter where you advocate for your opinion on educational policy. I'll talk more about that at a later date, but those are some of your assignments for this course. Let me pull the actual syllabus over and let's look at it together. You will notice that we will be meeting on Wednesdays from 5:45 to 8:45 in the Media Center at Hampton High School for our face-to-face meetings, the first one again being on May 18th. My information is here, Dr. Dan Lane. My email address, my Thomas University email address is dlane@thomasu.edu. And this is my personal cell phone number. If you need to reach me, don't hesitate to reach out to me. That will be fine. I will check my thomasu.edu email address regularly, but probably just once a day. When we meet face-to-face, I'll give you another email address that I will check multiple times a day, that if you need a response very quickly, you may want to use the other email address. But Thomas University would prefer you use the thomasu.edu email address. And like I said, I will check it daily, but I may be able to respond more quickly to the other email address. If you need to set up office hours with me, well, I'm certainly willing to do that. We can do that via phone or virtually through Zoom, and we can have a synchronous meeting that way. The next information in the syllabus is some of the content information that you see in all of your syllabi from Thomas University. So we will go through that. Here is how you are graded in this course. Of course, discussion boards, as I mentioned before, are very important. That's 45% of your grade in this course. And so you'll be required to complete those discussion posts each week, again by Sunday for your original post and by Tuesday for your response to your cohort members. Educational technology, the podcast, the media summary, and a resource brochure you will design in this course. It will coincide with some of the work you're doing in your technology course, and so you'll be able to receive some technological assistance from your technology professor and then you'll be turning that in here to be graded for content. And then there's advocacy projects as well. You'll be required to advocate your own educational beliefs through a letter to a legislature and through a digital presentation. Again, there'll be more information that will be provided about that. You can see 45% of your grade is discussion board, 35% of the grade is educational technology, and 20% of your grade are those advocacy projects. Our university grading scale is the same as it is for all Thomas University courses. And this hybrid model, you have the specific class meeting dates for online and face-to-face, and we alternate back and forth, of course, alternating with the other technology course that you're taking at the same time. Our textbook is the Ravitch book, Reign of Error. If you've not ordered that, please do so quickly, because we will be jumping right into the first 7 chapters on our first face-to-face meeting. It is available on Amazon or anywhere you normally buy books, and it's relatively inexpensive. Moving down the page, you will find that there is a class outline. Now, this outline is here just for you to see kind of what's coming up. I've not put everything that we're going to do in the class outline, and I did that on purpose so that I can add some issues, some current issues as they come available. But the information in skeletal form is definitely here for you so that you can kind of see what's available. And we'll be talking more about that in our first face-to-face meeting on the 18th. Of course, you know the policies on attendance, being prompt, and being in class. Late assignments, I do understand that you are a working professional, and if you do have a very tough week for some reason and you just don't believe that you can get an assignment done, all I ask is that you please contact me prior to the due date and let me know that, and I will certainly extend grace in that scenario, because I understand sometimes life happens that we can't control, and I will be glad to work with you as best I can on that situation. Now, if you don't contact me prior to the due date, of course, that could be a problem, and it would affect your overall grade. Of course, working in class, we do expect you to be on time, turn off cell phones, no text messaging, etc., because we need to be engaged. We only have 4 face-to-face class meetings, so it's important that you're fully engaged during those 4 class meetings. And of course, online etiquette is important, especially in your discussion post, and I ask that you not use any type of text language, etc., in those discussion posts, and that if you do challenge someone, that you do it in a professional and academic manner, not in a rude or sarcastic manner. Okay? So that kind of gets us through the information about the syllabus. If you have specific questions about the syllabus, don't hesitate to contact me, or we can talk about them at the face-to-face meeting on May 18th. Of course, in Blackboard, you've got access to all of the digital materials for this class. You also have access to the Education Connection site resources that might help you with some of the assignments in this class. For the podcast, how to post your video to YouTube, how to make your digital presentation, etc. So that information is there for you, and it's there for you for all of your courses that you take at Thomas University. Honor Code reminder that adherence to Thomas University's Honor Code, that as a member of the Thomas University student body, you will not lie, cheat, or steal in any endeavor related to your academic pursuits, nor will you tolerate that behavior in others. And so just a reminder of that academic code that Thomas University has in place for all of its students and for its faculty members. So let's now take some time and get started. As you begin to read the Ravitch book, you will learn many things about educational policy, and it's important that you have kind of a firm understanding of how policy is created and what reform efforts have already been in place in our public educational system in America. So the purpose of this class is to focus on the privatization of education, which is sort of a new last 15 or so years of a spin on education where public funds are now being diverted to private enterprises. In that discussion, we will be talking a lot about standardized testing, about school choice, about vouchers, about Teach for America, and some of the other programs that are out there that are diverting some of our funds from public education. And so our primary outcome then is for you to be able to articulate your own position on educational policy, on any educational issues, and to be able to articulate that with clarity, accuracy, and passion, and in a variety of media, not just in a formal paper, but also in a variety of media that are widely accepted and widely used today. So how are public schools funded? Well, you may know that public schools receive their funds from local, state, and federal sources. Federal funding today for most school systems is around 10%, and the state and local government fund about 90% of what it costs to run a public school system. State funding is supposed to be about 80% of that 90% pot, and local funding about 20%. However, with the budget issues that we've experienced in recent years, that number is coming closer to 60-40, and in some systems it's even more 50-50. And so local systems are being expected to make up funds that in the past have been given to them by the state or by federal government. It's very interesting to note that education is the responsibility of the state. It is not the responsibility of the federal government. There's no mention of education in the U.S. Constitution, but it is in the state of Georgia Constitution. In our first face-to-face meeting, we will talk about the verbiage of education in the Georgia Constitution and whether or not we are meeting the essence of what is required by the Georgia Constitution. And because of the budget shortfalls that we've experienced, many school districts are now relying on private funding to help augment the amount of funds that come into the school coffers. They're having to do that through grants and through foundational incentives because they simply can't fund public education the way that they used to. So who sets educational policy? Where does policy come from? Well, states, as I said, have the primary responsibility for K through 12 education. They are responsible for setting those standards for students and teachers, for approving textbooks and curricula, and for determining funding levels. In Georgia, we use a QBE funding. That was a very outdated funding formula that was created in 1985. And if you look at what schools look like today and what schools look like in 1985, schools are very different, but we still have that same QBE funding formula. However, since the passage of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act in 1965, the federal government has begun to have an increasingly activist role in educational policy. They've put their hands in educational reform and educational policy, and they do that by holding a carrot of federal money. Basically, they provide guidelines, and they say that if you want our federal money, then you will follow our policy guidelines. And so there are many things in the schools today that are funded by the federal government. And I'm not sure that the public schools could exist without those federal funds. Things like Title I, many of you work in Title I schools. Title I does come from federal government. Our school nutrition program, most of the money for the school nutrition program comes from a federal grant. I'm sure many of you know about the Smart Snacks guidelines that came out just recently that have seriously changed how our school nutrition programs work. Again, that was linked to federal funds that if we didn't follow or don't follow those guidelines that came from the federal government, then the federal government has threatened to remove those federal funds that are provided to our schools for that. And so in those cases, schools are, their hands are tied and they have to abide by those guidelines, even though the federal government really shouldn't be creating those guidelines because they really don't have the responsibility for education. I've provided a timeline here of some things that have happened in education over the course of the last 50 to 60 years that are important as foundational elements of understanding what's happened in education, to understand the Ravitch book specifically. This is certainly not everything, it's not an exhaustive list, but it's a lot of stuff. And so I apologize for the small writing on the screen, and I won't read this to you, but I do want to touch some of the highlights. The first piece of real educational reform legislation came in 1954, and that was Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education, which ruled that separate is not equal, that schools could not be separated by race, even though the prevailing notion of the day was that they were separate and they were equal, but it was ruled that that was not constitutional. So that was one of the first pieces of educational reform that was enacted to desegregate schools. Of course, even today, we know that segregation still happens, but it happens in less obvious ways than it happened back in the 1950s. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1 as the first satellite into orbit around the Earth. And just like we've heard before, many people thought the sky was falling, that the Soviets beat us into space, and so the educational system must be at fault for the Soviets being superior educationally to be able to do that. Now, of course, we put the first man on the moon, but there was no pat on the back to the educational system when that happened, not too long after the Soviets launched Sputnik 1. In 1965, I mentioned before, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act was signed into law, and it was the purpose of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act was to try to level the playing field for those schools that were high income versus those schools that were low income, to provide some federal monies to help low income students. And this is where Title I comes from this act in 1965. It also created some special education centers, some scholarships for low income college students to try to inject some energy and enthusiasm into the public education system. In 1972, Title IX was enacted that prohibited discrimination under any educational program that received federal funds. Again, there goes that caveat of receiving federal funds. Title IX is what what talks about gender equity in sports and things like that schools have to abide by. In 72, Mills versus the Board of Education ruled that disabled children couldn't be excluded from public school. In 73, the Rehabilitation Act became law, guaranteeing civil rights for people with disabilities. Incidentally, if those students in your school that have 504s, that is civil rights legislation from 1973 and 75, Education for All Handicapped Children Act. The 504 legislation falls under that, and it is civil rights legislation, not like IDEA for special education. That Education for All Handicapped Children Act of 75 did require that all schools accepting federal funds provide equal access to students with physical and mental disabilities. In 1983, under Ronald Reagan, A Nation at Risk was produced, which was a report that basically said that American schools were failing, that American schools were not meeting up to the standards and the guidelines that were being achieved by other countries, and that America was in trouble as far as its educational system went, unless there were some pretty severe educational reforms put in place. In 92, the first charter school appeared, and that charter school was to be kind of an innovative school that was free from some of the guidelines and policy regulations, to try to be innovative to answer or to respond to what came out in A Nation at Risk. In 94, President Clinton signed Goals 2000, which was standards-based educational reform, again in response to the Nation at Risk. In 1998, school report cards were first brought on the scene that raised the level of teacher accountability and school accountability. Of course, we know in 1999 was the Columbine tragedy. Again, that was looked at as the decline or the failure of the American educational system, and even many looked at the 9/11 tragedy as the failure of the American education system. In 2001, George W. Bush signed into law No Child Left Behind, which was a reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And in No Child Left Behind, schools were charged with making AYP, Annual Yearly Progress, where students, not just students in the aggregate, but students in disaggregated student groups, had to meet certain educational targets. And if they did not, there were sanctions that were put in place for for those schools that did not meet those educational targets for each individual subgroup in their school. Many schools went on the needs improvement list, and some schools were even taken over by the government because of their status on the No Child Left Behind AYP group. And some of you may have even taught in some of those schools that experienced some of those sanctions that were put in place because of No Child Left Behind. In 2002, voucher programs were deemed constitutional. A voucher, we'll talk more about that in a few moments, but vouchers are ways that the money follows the student. So if parents are given the opportunity to take their child wherever they want to take their child, then their amount of taxes that they pay for education would be allowed to go with the student to fund private school in that case. And so that was a big blow to the public educational system. In 2004, IDEA, that's the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, was reauthorized, which modified some of the IEP process to align with No Child Left Behind. And those of you that are response to intervention folks that work in RTI, this is where RTI came from, and that RTI was presented as a new way to identify students that had specific learning disability. But very quickly in this prevention model became a way to deal with any student who shows academic weaknesses or academic challenges. RTI became the model for responding to that. The problem with this is that IDEA 2004 was completely unfunded. And so even though response to intervention came on the scene and made some pretty significant requirements of schools, schools have a very difficult time implementing RTI because there's no funds to support that implementation of RTI. And some people would say, excuse me, that's a way to set the schools up for failure. You tell them you've got to do this, but you provide no funds to do it. That'll set them up for failure, and then you can say, well, look, schools really are failing just like we said they are. They can't even do this legislation that we've put in place. In 2007, the reauthorization of No Child Left Behind was proposed. However, it was vetoed by President Bush because of money. He didn't have the money to support that reauthorization. 2008, President Obama did propose changes to No Child Left Behind, but it failed as well. And so No Child Left Behind sort of just sat there in educational policy for many years. Incidentally, in 2014, all schools were to be at 100% proficiency for all students of all subgroups. And I don't think anyone would say that's a realistic goal, but still, schools that didn't make that goal were to be on the needs improvement list. So basically, every school in America would be on a needs improvement list for not meeting that goal. Excuse me. You'll see in 2009 the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act. This is federal legislation, provided more than $90 billion for education. That included Race to the Top. That was federal legislation where literally schools competed, or school systems competed, for those federal dollars in Race to the Top. It began to look more like free enterprise system, like competition, than looking like public education. 2009 Common Core Standards Initiative came on the scene. We won't go there. There's some political ramifications to that. We won't talk about that. Of course, you know about the Great Depression that happened starting in 2008 but through 2010. In 2012, Obama does sign legislation that offers flexibility regarding some of those specific requirements of No Child Left Behind. That is sort of what paved the way for Georgia to be able to change its evaluation system from AYP to CCRPI, the College and Career Ready Performance Index. So we were allowed to do that as long as we had measures that talked about teacher effectiveness and about school effectiveness, etc. And our CCRPI does that, especially with new TEKS and LEAKS evaluation systems. You can see that in the last couple of years, last few years, we've had some unprecedented teacher layoffs and school closings because of lack of adequate funding in the American system. In 2013, a landmark movie was created that was really propaganda, and that was Waiting for Superman. You will watch that movie as part of this course, and you'll see that it very much puts the blame for the American educational system on ill-prepared teachers. I'll be interested to see your reaction to Waiting to Superman after you watch it. You'll see in 2014 there was a demographic milestone reached that minority students in America exceeded Caucasian students, non-Hispanic Caucasian students, for the first time in the history of the American educational system. And we began to see in 2015 parents opting out of standardized testing, President Obama getting on the bandwagon and saying, yes, there's too much testing. And then, we all know about the House bill that was just approved for us in Georgia, basically talking about too much testing as well. Back at the end of 2015, just a few months ago, President Obama did sign into law the Every Student Succeeds Act that is a latest version of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. So it replaces No Child Left Behind. So No Child Left Behind has essentially been left behind, which does give more state control in judging school quality. And so that's our CCRPI does align very well with the with ESSA. And you'll see that some of those issues that are out there, more schools are closing, more teachers are being laid off because our educational woes, our funding woes, are still there. And of course, the corporate America is saying, look at how American schools are failing, and it's not necessarily our fault, but they're wanting to blame that it's our fault. As you continue to read in Ravitch, there's a few terms that I'd like to pre-teach to you, so make sure that you understand them before you begin embarking on reading Ravitch, which is a very interesting read, by the way. I don't think you'll find it cumbersome in the least bit. NAEP is an organization that does a national assessment that's given to multiple countries. It's the only way we can compare apples to apples from our country to other countries, and so in the Ravitch book you will see a lot, or you'll hear a lot of information about NAEP and how American students have scored on NAEP assessments as compared to our counterparts in other countries around the world. School choice, I mentioned briefly earlier, is when parents are given the freedom to choose their child's school, to send their child to any school that they wish, and that the money follows the student. And so the prevailing notion here is that healthy competition would prevail among schools, kind of like the free enterprise competitive system that we have for our economy in America. They think that this would work for schools as well, and so if schools have to compete for those students, then that should improve schools. And so it doesn't matter whether those schools are public or private, whether they're near or far, religious or secular, whatever works best for that child should be allowed to go to that school, and the tax money that accompanies that student should follow the student to that school. Vouchers, same idea as school choice, except vouchers give parents to choose a private school using all of that public school funding that's set aside for that student to go to that private school. Of course, that would be a windfall for those private schools, and it would be very difficult for public schools. And there are some states that do allow vouchers. We don't have a voucher program in Georgia right now, but there are some states that allow vouchers, and those states are struggling. Their public education system is really suffering from the lack of funds. Public magnet schools are public schools that that are circulated around a theme. And there are some of these schools in Georgia. Some of those themes could be STEM, science and technology, engineering, mathematics. It could be performing arts. It could be early college. It could be pretty much any idea that students would come together that have a common interest, and students would receive specialized instruction in that common interest. So there's a hands-on, minds-on approach to learning because it's supposedly going to be more highly engaging for students if they are spending the majority of their time in an area that truly interests them, is the prevailing notion and the rationale behind those magnet schools. Charter schools are independent public schools. They are public schools, but they're exempt from many of the local rules and regulations in exchange for increased financial and academic accountability, that they are supposed to be able to be very accountable and to submit records that show that they're being very financially responsible, even though they're not having to meet all of the same regulations for certification, for seat time, things like that, that a regular public high school has to, or a regular public school has to show. They were supposed to be laboratories of innovation where things were tested, and then some of those ideas were then sent over to the regular public schools, but that really hasn't happened. Michelle Rhee, you may know of, was the Chancellor of Education in the Washington, D.C. public schools from 2007 to 2010. She founded an organization called Students First, which was a nonprofit organization which looked into things like teacher tenure and getting rid of teacher tenure. She was also instrumental in Teach for America, which is an alternative certification program, and there are some districts in Georgia that use Teach for America teachers. Very interestingly, Teach for America is not sponsored by any educational foundation. It's sponsored by people like the Walton family of Walmart, State Farm, Bank of America, FedEx, Texas Instruments, AT&T, and a whole cadre of different businesses and organizations that support free enterprise. And so they're looking at a way to make money off of public education. And that's a lot of what Ravitch talks about. So, your homework coming up in Blackboard. You are going to do an introduction video. I know you may know each other, having worked together in your cohort, but I'd like to know a little bit about you. And if you will answer 2 questions for me, one thing you love about education and one thing you'd change if you could, and be specific. Don't just say, I'd change TEKS. Tell me specifically what would you change, because there are some good things about that. So if you'll answer those questions on video, upload it to YouTube, and then provide the link for me on the discussion board, I would appreciate that. I'm not requiring you to respond to your classmates there, but you may want to watch some of those videos to get to know a little bit more about your classmates and your cohort members. I think that would be very interesting. Also, you will watch Waiting for Superman. There is a link there for you to watch that movie, so do set aside that time, pop some popcorn, and enjoy Waiting for Superman. You're going to read the critics on Waiting for Superman, and there's going to be a discussion post about that. So you can see that it talks a little bit in this example about charter schools and how charter schools have never done what charter schools are supposed to do, and that their test scores are really no higher than public schools. You'll read the first 7 chapters of the Ravitch book, and so come to our class on May 18th ready to talk about Ravitch chapters 1 through 7 and to talk about Waiting for Superman. And you will respond to the discussion post there on Waiting for Superman. From your perspective as a teacher, please do post your original comments by Sunday the 15th, and your final deadline for responding to your peers is Tuesday the 17th by 11:59. There is a rubric in the rubrics folder that tells you what I will use to assess your discussion posts. So, I think that's enough for our first session. I am looking forward to a very interesting term. I think we're going to have some really robust and vigorous conversations. Don't be afraid to participate in those conversations because I really, my main point in this course for you is to engage with the content. So don't be afraid to engage with that content and to talk about it and to wrestle with some of those issues of public education policy. Hopefully this will expand your view of education, and you'll begin to see education at a much broader scope than just the scope of your classroom there. As teacher leaders, you really need to have an understanding of the greater picture of the American educational system. So I'm looking forward to our first meeting next week, and I hope you have a good time in your preparations. Thanks so much.